Okay, I'm going to do the top tens book tag I believe started by Jason's Old Blues Chapter and Verse, a booktuber I know well as a booktuber and have met in person, and I find very conducive in terms of thinking about books. Although, actually, our top tens are very different, and I certainly couldn't put Bleak House at the top of my list. A book I'm just not a Dickens fan, as people know, but and there is no overlapping on our list. I've given this. I mean, I love doing. I'm quite happy to talk top tens of anything. It just gives it's a kind of a masculine pleasure. I think I'm just going to do fiction because you're allowed to include plays and poems and works of non-fiction. But actually, that becomes too difficult. I can't. I'm not comparing like with like in those terms. And also he's keeping a list, so a book gets more points in the overall structure if it goes at the top. I've tried to think about that list, but actually, after about the fifth book, they're all the same. And I'm sure I've forgotten something and missed something absolutely critical. And for those of you who watch this channel, you will know many of these books, because my first is, which I've talked about endlessly. I'm going to call it for now the Gilead Trilogy by Marilyn Robinson, because I think he allowed books that have those kind of theme, character and story connections. But if I had, because I can't choose between Gilead, the first novel, and Home, the second novel, I need to reread Leela. But the Gilead Trilogy, for me at the moment, is my favourite. If I had to say my favourite book. And I do think that what's interesting about top 10 lists is they change over time. Now, of course, I read those in my early 40s, or over my early 40s, and they wouldn't have been around in a top 10 list in my 20s or 30s, and therefore they make way. But on the other hand, books that had made very strong impressions on me then have been set aside for more present books, because one grows up. So sort of weighing what you think is important now compared to what had influence, that's another kind of, that's quite another kind of difficult conflict to resolve. So I think in a sense this contains mostly stuff that has had a deep effect on me more recently, although number 3 is Crime and Punishment, which I wouldn't be who I was without reading it when I was 14. But anyway, before we get to number 3, and this will be no surprise for anybody, number 2 is Light Years by James Salter, and that's there because I love it, but I love it sentence to sentence, which in a way that I don't love any other book. And I could have chosen another James Salter, but actually it contains my favourite piece of writing of all time, which is the second paragraph of the second chapter. Crime and Punishment is next, which I said made me because I read it at 14. I don't think I would have been the person I am if I hadn't read it, and I certainly wouldn't have written the novel I've just written had I not read that, and then other Dostoevsky. And just so anyone knows, Tolstoy didn't make it into my list, although I do love War and Peace. Zone by Matthias N.R., published by Fitzcarraldo Editions, is my number 4. I often say it's the most serious novel ever written in all time, and I still maintain that. It's written in one glorious unfolding sentence about the terrible conflicts of the 20th century in the zone, which is kind of Europe and North Africa. An astonishing feat of writerly ingenuity, intellectual robustness, and real humanity at the same time. An extraordinary book. Herzog, Saul Bellow, I love because I love this idea that for me, Saul Bellow is the only person to have written a truly 19th century novel in the 20th century and made it a 20th century artifact. So it's not, his kind of sort of predecessor in terms of style, volume, character, whatever, is probably Dickens. But you don't read them like they're 19th century novels. You read them like they're mid 20th century American novels, but they have all the kind of vivacity of a 19th century novel. And so, Herzog is just so sublimely written, funny, tragic, and just full of energy. This is when order starts to go a bit off, because I can't really make up my mind. So the next one I've got is The Siege of Krishnapur by J.G. Farrell, which I only read about 2 years ago. And this is because J.G. Farrell is one of those, he's such a natural writer that style doesn't feel like style, but there's a kind of elegance and grace to his writing that means he's just like someone like War or I can't think of who else, Nabokov or someone, who they just have the gift. But with this, it's just also an extraordinary kind of adventure, and so it is the joy of reading near perfect writing in a wonderful story, and very few writers achieve that. 7 was going to be Wallace Stevens, but I've taken out poetry and I've moved in Sometimes a Great Nation. Although I always sometimes think it's called Sometimes a Great Nation, but anyway, it's one or the other. My mind always goes slightly funny with that. By what's his name? God, sorry, I should have written these down better. Who by Ken Kesey. An extraordinarily rich, textured, kind of proper modernist novel in proper American modernist novel that somehow hasn't just co-opted the European tradition, but really it's an extraordinary novel about family and work life, and somehow it's just someone. I mean, obviously I keep saying the same things about great writing, but they are my top 10 list. Of course they're going to be. But it's someone not only writing at their powers, I think exceeding their powers. They've just found something that writes itself, and therefore all the energy that you would take to write something means that it actually builds this thing into an even greater experience. I really love it. And then we've got À la recherche de la temps perdu, Proust, which is obviously played a huge role for me in my life, and I don't know how I feel about it now, but I think I'm putting an 8th. 9th, and what's interesting when we count these is so many are American. 9th, we have The Runaway Soul, Howard Brodkey, another important book which I read in my late 20s or early or mid 20s even. And it's important to me because it's what I call the first, if not only, phenomenological novel, which is the lived experience of the central character, and I'm going to be writing about this at some point soon. It is in its own way unreadable, super indulgent, but as Brodkey said, he actually created a new way of writing. He wrote these extraordinary short stories in the 1950s. And then somehow the what he was doing was not a sufficient instrument to say what he wanted to say. So he created this style, and it is extraordinary. I I think for doing that, I can't ever, when I sit down and read a bit, I sit there and just think that is some feat to create a new way of writing that doesn't feel like anyone has done that before. Now, 10, it's one of those things where you kind of have to go, I've got 5 and I will get there in the end. So Moby Dick feels as though I can't not include that. The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn feels that I can't not have that. I've got Hamlet there, but we're not doing that now. The Iliad, maybe that's a poem, so we don't want to include that. And then we have my kind of outlier, which is Omen Setter's Luck by William H. Gass, which I don't think, which didn't give me as much pleasure as Huck Finn, which I don't think is as important as Moby Dick. But Omen Setter's Luck, very few books have made me think about what the writer was trying to achieve and how extraordinary that kind of reaching for kind of a kind of creative enterprise, that it's one of the oddest books I've ever read. But I'm going to throw it in above Huck Finn and Moby Dick because A, I think more people should read it, and B, I just think it's got a sensibility which transcends just, that was my dog, shh, Wolfie, which transcends the novelist and I mean, and some of these do. I mean, La Recherche does that. Obviously, Brodkey does that. Zone does that. But it's a sort of, it kind of feels almost a kind of religious act in terms of what the prose is trying to achieve, and that he won't settle. There isn't a moment in it where you feel he will settle for something cheap or easy or just a moment of repose. It's worked so hard, and actually that you can kind of feel the work, which should be a negative, but actually it's not. It's kind of, terrible kind of metaphor, or analogy. It is like looking at someone and go, at one of those unfinished Michelangelos of the old prophets, and you realised, kind of, that was hard work to hew that out of the rock. Anyway, so I'm going for that. So, I mean, I haven't been particularly articulate. Because I've talked about these in other things, but I think that's where I'm going to stay for now. So, Marilyn Robinson's Gilead Trilogy, Lightyear Salter, Crime and Punishment, Dostoevsky, Zone, Matthias N.R., Herzog, Saul Bellow, Siege of Krishnapur, J.G. Ballard, Sometimes a Great Notion, I'm going to have to check that in a minute, Ken Kesey, À la Recherche de la Temps Perdu, Runaway Soul, Harold Brodkey, Omen Setter's Luck, William H. Gass, which makes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 American novelists out of 10, and I have to say only one woman. See, I told you there would be one I'd forgotten, and now I've got it. Sorry. The House of Mirth, Edith Wharton, and I'm going to, because they're contemporaneous, I'm going to replace À la Recherche de la Temps Perdu with that, which is I'm glad there's another woman in there, but it doesn't make another American, so it's 7 out of 10 Americans. Okay, that's it. Thank you. Bye.